Every year, more and more sections of our national parks are being marked as restricted areas. Now, this wouldn't be unusual if these areas were being closed for conservation or research. But that's not what's happening here. Park rangers are coming forward, sharing their stories of the bizarre and strange within the confines of our country's national parks. But it's far stranger than you can ever imagine. You won't want to miss this one. In the early summer of 2019, James Caravello was working nights at Yellowstone National Park. James was 34 and had been a park ranger at Yellowstone for several years. Before that, he had served in the Coast Guard for a brief time, and among his colleagues, James was known for being extremely level-headed and reliable. James lived alone in the ranger housing complex near the west entrance, and every morning before his shift, he would stand in this exact spot and take in the view. James had his coffee in one hand and was watching the early morning fog roll through the valley. The park was quiet, but on this particular morning, something caught his attention that seemed off. The distinct sound of helicopter blades cutting through the morning air. When James looked, he realized several things. Firstly, this chopper was flying way too low, and secondly, it was completely black with no markings of any kind. James watched as it emerged from behind the tree line, and it was moving slow, almost like it was searching for something. Now, during his time in the Coast Guard, James had worked with plenty of military aircraft, but even he knew there was something off about this. Most military aircraft, even though used for covert operations, often have some kind of identifying mark, even if subtle, but to have a completely black chopper suggests something more sinister. The helicopter was flying directly over a section of the park that was restricted to all air traffic. So James pulled out his phone to take a picture, but by the time he got his camera ready, the chopper had vanished behind the mountains. Now he couldn't quite place his finger on it, but something in his gut told him there was something off. After this, he went about his normal morning routine. He made himself a second cup of coffee in the break room, checked the daily incident reports, and headed out for his first patrol. Being a ranger meant most of his day involved petty, mundane tasks, checking permits, giving directions to a lot of tourists, and making sure nobody was feeding wildlife. James spent the next few hours helping a family whose car had overheated near one of the geysers, and writing up a citation for someone who had wandered off the marked trail. It was the kind of standard day he had done hundreds of times before, and in the afternoon, while patrolling one of the trails, he came across several SUVs parked on one of the service roads. These weren't parked vehicles, and they didn't have any government plates or markings. When he approached the vehicles to investigate, they were empty. He pulled his ranger vehicle to a stop about 20 feet behind the black SUVs, and he just sat there for a moment, watching for any movement, but there was nothing. And so he stepped out of his vehicle and began walking towards these mysterious cars. And the closer he got, the more unusual these vehicles seemed. They were completely clean, which made no sense because the service road they were on was really dusty. And James walked up to the driver's side window of the first SUV, cupped his hands around his eyes to look inside, and the interior was completely empty, not even a piece of paper on the seat. He made his way to the second SUV and did the same thing again. Now it was spotless, locked doors. So he walked around both vehicles looking for any identifying marks or plates, but there was none. It was like these vehicles had just appeared out of nowhere, even though the tire tracks leading up to where they were parked seemed to just start suddenly, as if these SUVs had been dropped from the sky. Now, after about 10 minutes of investigating and trying to figure this out, James pulled out his notepad and wrote down the exact location and time. He considered calling it in, but something in his gut told him not to. Instead, he got back in his vehicle and continued. When he drove past the same spot 3 hours later, the SUVs were gone, and there were no signs they had ever been there. Well, a few days after that, James noticed that a large section of the park had been suddenly fenced off. There was a sign that said it was a maintenance area, but James knew there was no maintenance scheduled for that location. In fact, that area wasn't even on any of the maps. And shortly after this happened, James started experiencing bizarre radio dead zones. During his normal patrols, his radio signal would just randomly cut out. Keep in mind that this had never happened to him before. However, during the course of all of this, James would often hear these bizarre sounds that were similar to whispering. Now, shortly after this, James walked into the ranger station office one morning and found his supervisor sitting at his desk. And so James told him about all the radio dead zones he'd been finding and explaining how his radio would just suddenly cut out in areas where it had always worked fine before. His supervisor barely had to look up at him from his paperwork and just said it was probably due to some routine maintenance on the radio towers. Probably wasn't true because this wasn't like a typical maintenance issue. Not believing what he said, he just pressed his supervisor harder, and that's when the man's entire demeanor changed. He just put down his pen, looked directly at James, and told him to drop it. So, when James tried to argue that this was a safety issue, he just calmly got up and walked out of the office. Not satisfied with that interaction, James would bring this up with another supervisor, and his response was far more strange. The moment James had mentioned the radio dead zones, this man's face just went pale, and he quickly changed the subject and made an excuse to leave. So, James noticed after that this man started avoiding him whenever he could. Now, that evening, James was reviewing his patrol logs when he realized something that made his stomach drop. Every single radio dead zone he documented was in or near one of the new restricted areas. But when he tried to access the maintenance schedule for those areas, he discovered his computer access had been revoked. Now, there were similar strange reports that had started appearing in and around those areas, specifically in the backcountry. And in one area in particular, a cluster of elk remains were discovered. There were 3 elk skulls that were found in close proximity. Though not perfectly arranged, there was no blood at the scene, and the only thing they found was the heads, which appear to have been cut with very sharp tools or blades. Other reports of unusual animal deaths began to surface around this time, and there was one that involved a bison carcass with large sections of hide removed, seemingly again with a sharp instrument. Another report described a deer carcass with its internal organs exposed, but they were also melted, as if it had been exposed to intense localized heat. And you had the surrounding foliage, which showed no signs of scorching or fire, which again suggested a highly focused energy. The left side of the deer, which was touching the ground, appeared viscous and gelatinous in consistency, like the flesh had begun to melt. Tissue samples had been collected, but nothing conclusive had come from it. Strangely, despite the apparent heat damage to the flesh, the deer's fur on the affected side remained largely intact. But one of the most bizarre was a deceased juvenile grizzly bear found lodged in the branches of a large tree. The manner of death is disturbing. A significant portion of the bear's skull was removed, with the brain and eyes missing. Upon inspection, it looked as if the bear had been placed there and could not be explained away by scavengers or other natural means. Now, this was all happening around the same time that the black helicopters were being spotted in and around the area. Now, fast forward to July 15th, 2019, and James was patrolling right around the Old Faithful area when he spotted these unusual lights coming from inside one of the restricted zones. And so he drove closer to investigate, and he saw multiple military transport vehicles parked in a clearing. Now, James is trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and he notices these huge containers. I mean, massive. Some of them looked like they were, holding something. They were covered, but you couldn't see inside. They were big enough to hold what you could only imagine. And he's looking at this whole scene, trying to figure out what's going on, and there were men walking around in what appeared to be hazmat-like suits. But before James could get any closer, he was stopped by an armed personnel who said they were part of a geological survey team and told him to leave the area immediately. Well, after that night, James really began documenting everything strange he saw. He noticed the helicopter activity would increase during new moon phases, and his equipment would experience weird electromagnetic interference near certain areas. And he started finding strange tracks that didn't match any known wildlife in the park. Now, Around 2:15 in the morning on August 2nd, James was driving down one of the maintenance roads near Shoshone Lake. Earlier that same evening, 3 different hikers and tourists had reported seeing strange lights in this area. James figured it was probably just people camping where they weren't supposed to, but as he rounded a bend in the road, he saw something that made him immediately kill his headlights. Up ahead were multiple military-style vehicles with their lights on, illuminating what looked like a makeshift checkpoint. James could see armed personnel in tactical gear standing guard, and so he pulled his vehicle off the road and into some brush. He grabbed his gear bag and quietly made his way through the woods, using his 8 years of experience to move quietly through the darkness. After about 20 minutes of careful movement, he found a position on a small ridge that overlooked whatever this operation was. He pulled out his binoculars and settled in behind a fallen tree. The entire hillside below him was lit up with these portable floodlights. There were dozens of people in what looked like hazmat suits moving between different stations. Some had clipboards, others were operating strange-looking equipment he'd never seen before. That's when James heard this loud mechanical grinding sound, and he watched through his binoculars as he could see these massive hydraulic doors that had been built into one of these large containers begin to open. Additionally, he also saw multiple containment units that looked like these giant glass tubes that were being wheeled out on some kind of track system. Each unit had what appeared to be monitoring equipment attached to it. Through the glass, he could clearly see that there was some kind of being coming out of the container, and he would describe its skin as being pale and almost translucent, and that it was easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and it moved very unnaturally, and he could see that the armed personnel who were handling this being were being very methodic, being very careful, and the entire area was bathed in this strange bluish light that seemed to be coming from inside these containers. Instantly, James just felt this wave of nausea crash into him, and his head started pounding like someone was driving a nail into his skull. Not knowing what to do, he just reached for his radio to call for backup, but got nothing but static. When he checked his GPS unit, the screen would just show gibberish. Fighting through the headache, he pulled out his phone and tried taking pictures, but every time he tried to focus on the containment units, his phone's camera would glitch out. After this, he just fled the area, unsure of what to do. Now, this weighed really heavy on his conscience for days and days, and the following next few mornings, he spent hunched over his toilet, violently ill from whatever had happened to him from what he had saw. In fact, he had called in sick, which is something he'd never done in all the years he'd worked. Now, when he finally made it back, things definitely felt different. There was now what appeared to be military vehicles in certain administrative areas, and teams of men in tactical gear doing what appeared to be routine patrols. The gist that James got was that these guys were searching for something, or maybe guarding something. A lot of the areas accessible by the public remained open and untouched, so tourists and hikers probably didn't notice anything. But in certain areas that were only accessible to staff, well, some of it was blocked off due to geological instability, which is really interesting because months prior to this, there had been several UFO sightings and video recordings taken in and around this area. Now, disturbingly, a park employee named Sean had submitted several videos to his supervisors showing these strange lights hovering over the caldera area. The footage showed 4 different types of UFOs over the course of just 1 month. Oddly, the correlation here is just really strange because all of these sightings were all concentrated in the same areas where he'd been finding those radio dead zones. And for James, the dates of these sightings lined up perfectly for when he first started noticing the black helicopters and unmarked vehicles. And like I said, for whatever reason, James noticed there was this heightened increase of activity during certain lunar phases. Now, during this time, 4 of his fellow rangers were suddenly transferred to other parks with no notice. When James had asked about this, his supervisor would just say it was routine staffing adjustments, but there was nothing routine about how quickly they disappeared. They were just there one day and then gone the next. And perhaps one of the strangest aspects of this entire story is that you had multiple tourists and hikers reporting the same thing over this small window of time. Low humming noises that would make them feel extremely sick. Several had reported other strange events while on trails and in camping areas. Everything from eclipse-like events where the day would suddenly turn to night momentarily before going back to day that nobody else beside them seemed to experience. You had people experiencing missing time and other strange anomalies like lights in the sky and strange crafts being spotted. And of course, nothing was ever officially addressed. Like the crafts that were caught in Sean's video and reported by hikers and park visitors, it was all written off as nothing more than just weather balloons. And one of the most sci-fi like things to have been spotted in and around, well, not just Yellowstone, but other national parks as well, is what people have described as these large black boxes or cubes just showing up at random. They vary in size, but all are reported to be relatively large and of unknown origin. One park ranger, similar to James's case, explained that there was just a lot of military activity right around the time one had been reported by a couple of hikers near one of the trails. A man who used the name Brendan decided to share their story.
I've held on to this story for a while now, not quite sure how or even if I should tell it, but seeing how there seem to be more people stepping forward with bizarre incidents from parks around the country, I figure maybe it's time I share mine. I'm keeping my name and any super specific details under wraps because I signed paperwork, non-disclosure forms basically, that I'm sure would get me in trouble if anyone traced this back to me. I'm not looking for notoriety or anything like that, just a bit of release from what's been weighing on my mind. Back in 2019, I spent about 9 months working as a seasonal employee at a well-known national park. I'd prefer not to name which one for reasons I just mentioned. My main duties varied. Sometimes I'd be helping the front desk at the visitor center. Other times I'd be out on the trails doing light maintenance or guiding hikers when they got turned around. The landscape was gorgeous. One incident, though, made me question everything about that place. It was late spring, maybe early May. I remember that because the snowmelt was in full force, but the heavy tourist crowds hadn't arrived yet. We had a surprising number of calls coming in about a large black box that hikers claimed to have spotted near a lesser traveled trail. At first, I brushed it off as a weird rumor, or maybe someone was playing a prank. Folks sometimes haul out odd objects to the woods to take strange photos, believe it or not. But after the third or fourth mention, in just a couple of days, I mentioned it to my immediate supervisor. He told me to go take a look. So, one morning when I was scheduled for trail patrol, I set out. This particular trail wound through thick pines, not heavily maintained or marked, and because of that, it's rarely crowded. The clearing in question wasn't too far off the main path, surrounded by tall ferns, a little trickle of a stream. But as I approached, I noticed a heaviness in the air, like static electricity before a lightning storm. And in the center of the clearing, there was indeed a large black box just sitting there in plain sight. Or at least the finish was matte black, with no logos or markings I could see. It was maybe 8 feet tall, about 6 feet wide, though it was hard to gauge precisely. Perfectly rectangular, like a shipping container, but smaller, and without any visible doors or hinges. The second I stepped closer, the air got thicker. That's the best way I can describe it. My ears felt like they were popping, like sudden altitude change, and I had an immediate sense of dread. I'd never felt that kind of raw, primal fear before, not even when I had close calls with wildlife. Almost like every cell in my body was screaming, "Leave now." The closer I got, the stronger the feeling of static, and the more my stomach churned. I saw nothing but smooth, dark surfaces. No seams, no keypad, no vents. Just a big black monolith out of nowhere. I was maybe 10 feet away when I decided I needed backup. I wasn't going to figure this out on my own. I radioed in to my supervisor, describing what I found. He didn't say much, just told me to get back to the station immediately. No clarification, no follow-up questions. I remember my supervisor was very stern, and he explicitly stated, do not talk about this with anybody else. Do not talk to other staff about it. And so it was unlike him to be so abrupt. When I got back, I tried to press him for details, but he shut me down hard. He actually said words to the effect of, you didn't see anything, and we're not discussing this further. My supervisor was always just a really great guy, and this was really out of character for him. And so, the next day I arrived for my shift a bit later than usual. My schedule had changed ironically, and I was slotted for front desk duty at the visitor center. Around mid-morning, I saw an unusual number of vehicles rolling in. Military convoys, if you can believe that. A couple of big trucks and a black SUV or two. They headed toward, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a lesser-known trail that runs parallel to it. The entire area was suddenly roped off, closed for maintenance, or some nonsense like that. But I'd never seen a closure happen so quickly. Signs went up overnight. No staff allowed, save for a select few. The word around the ranger station was that some kind of high-priority ecological study was going on, but I know BS when I hear it. Other staff were confused too, but that section stayed restricted for the remainder of my tenure. But this was strange. But I did pass a vantage point once near a ridge where I saw a cluster of men in military fatigues stationed at the edge of that clearing. That's all I want to share without risking too much.
Just like with Brendan's story, James too was threatened. Right around the end of August of that year, during the height of all of this, James was called in by one of his supervisors at the time and was basically threatened for snooping around in areas he shouldn't. James, who was obviously very caught off guard by this, tried to pry for more information about what he had done wrong, but the only response he was given was to just leave it alone, to stop snooping. And within days, James was just sitting at his kitchen table one morning, reviewing his notes from the past few weeks, when he heard a knock at his door. Now, he looked through the window and saw there was a black sedan that was parked in his driveway that hadn't been there a moment ago. So when he opened the door, two men in identical black suits were just standing there on his porch. They didn't show any badges or ID, they didn't introduce themselves, and the taller one of the two just asked if they could come inside to discuss some administrative matters. James realized he was probably in a lot of trouble, and so he just led them to his kitchen where all of his notes were spread out across the table. But before he can gather them up, because he was kind of embarrassed by it, the shorter man of the two picked up one of the papers and began reading it. The taller one just stood there and stared at James without blinking, and so the shorter man began asking him about his recent activities and asked him if he had been into any restricted areas. Had he witnessed anything unusual? Had he discussed his concerns with anyone? And there was just something very off about how he spoke. It was almost mechanical. And after a short conversation, the tall one just looked right at James and explained that they had reviewed his military service record and that it was impressive, but that it would be a shame if his promising career ahead of him had to be cut short. The shorter man simply placed James's paper back on the table and smiled and told James that some things in the park were classified for good reason, that sometimes the best thing a person could do for their country was just to forget about what they'd seen. And before leaving, the taller one placed his business card on the table. It was completely blank except for a phone number, and all he told James was that to call the number if he remembered anything else he needed to forget. So after they left, James just ran to the window and watched as their sedan pulled away, and of course, he noticed it had no license plate. When he went back to his kitchen to gather up his notes, he realized the paper the shorter man had been reading was now gone. After this event, James really began to fear for his life, and this is when he kind of began to withdraw from his normal social activities outside of work. He became much more reclusive and stopped documenting anything unusual. He had no idea how high the stakes were, but knew that things were now getting out of hand quickly. There are other stories, stories that go back decades, stories that suggest something strange has been happening in Yellowstone for a very long time.
It was in the winter of 1980, and my older brother and I were hiking and camping in Yellowstone National Park. After a 5-mile hike from the road up to a lake that reportedly was the only place in North America to catch Arctic grayling, other than in the Arctic, we set up camp for the night. After eating our day's catch and cleaning up, we settled in for bed early as we could for the night. We were exhausted from the day's hike and fishing. We were in our tent, quietly talking and starting to get drowsy, when we suddenly heard something run by us, but it was on 2 legs, something very large and heavy. We looked at each other with eyes bulging out of our heads, and I told him to go see what it was. He replied, "No effing way." And as we had no sidearms or weapons, we both just sat there, terrified for the rest of the night. Well, at daybreak, we broke camp and left there, looking for tracks, but because the ground was bare, there was no sign of our midnight visitor, except for our experience. The footsteps were extremely heavy, and I know for a fact they were bipedal and running at an unhurried pace, like it was trying to cover some ground. I can't remember if I said this already, but this was in October of 1980, and I can't remember the name of the lake. It was one of the headwater lakes.
You have these reports from 2019, James's experiences, animal mutilations, the military presence, strange lights, the missing time, and then you have stories like these ones from almost 40 years earlier and further back. All the while, strange things kept happening. It was during this time that James tried reaching out to a close friend using encrypted communications. This friend could help him open the door for sharing the information to the public. However, shortly after the conversation, he began receiving threatening phone calls from unknown numbers telling him very personal details about his life, and various threats included. With everything that James was risking losing, he decided to not pursue his investigations and stopped altogether. James lives in a small town in the Pacific Northwest. He works as a private wilderness guide and refuses to discuss anything about Yellowstone after this, but he still experiences occasional surveillance, and he still refuses to tell his full name. It makes you wonder what's really going on in or underneath Yellowstone. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment below containment zone, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy cinematic storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.